Okay, so let's open up at chapter 18 of John and have an opportunity for some conversation. It's so long ago, 3 weeks ago, since we last talked. I can't remember. I know that we noticed that John put the account of Peter's denial interspersed with the interrogation of Jesus, and so it swapped from one to another like a spotlight, that one moment shone there, next moment came over there. So it was very interesting the way he chose to do it. We have Jesus being interrogated and being able to stay honest, and we have Peter being interrogated and coming up with a load of lies. Peter, of course, was very grieved when Jesus came out, and as he came out of, I think it was the high priest's accommodation, he turns and looks at Peter. Peter remembered the cock has crowed, and he remembers that he was going to let Jesus down. And we're told he went out and wept bitterly. Well, so I know we talked about that, and I'm not sure what else we might have said. So does anybody want to either remind me or ask a question based on chapter 18 and possibly from verse 28? Have you frozen, Dorothy, or can you not remember what the question was? I think you've frozen. Is Dorothy frozen on everybody's screen? Oh, you're back. You froze, Dorothy.
Oh, it's because right.
I asked a question, and then we waited for you to repeat it, and it never came.
Oh, right. It was, what did Jesus teach?
Oh, yes.
We know one. He read from Isaiah, I think. Did he? Was he in Nazareth then?
Right, probably.
Quite early on. And I can't place it, but I have a feeling he read from Isaiah, and then they said he preached on it. Because he was saying in a way that he was fulfilling the scripture in Isaiah.
Yes,
was it 61? That's very interesting, Jean.
Yes, it was 61, wasn't it? Isaiah 61.
Yeah. But that's the only one I can think of off my top of my head.
So otherwise, his teaching was in the form of parables.
Another one.
So if you could remember a parable, you need to think about what was he teaching. So prodigal son, what was he teaching?
Oh, I thought he did parables outside. I don't know why I thought that. I thought.
And you differentiated it from what he did when he was in the synagogue.
This is talking about.
Okay. No, it's all could all be teaching. So
it's all teaching, but that's.
So if he taught through parables, what was the lesson that came through the parable of the prodigal son?
Well, love, I should think.
The father was forgiving.
Forgiveness.
One message.
Okay. So it's really about forgiveness. Got this amazing situation. I think it's also about grace, because he comes back to his father with a speech ready that he was going to give to become a slave, become a servant. But his father stops him short and restores him as a son. So he does more than forgive him. He forgives and restores him. So that's about grace. Because, of course, grace is getting anything or more than we deserve. And mercy is getting what we don't deserve. No, got it the wrong way around. Mercy is getting what we don't deserve. I did say it right. That's right.
Had any choice in denying Christ? I mean, I know that we're into the realm of do we have free will or not? But when Jesus said, you're going to deny me 3 times, did Peter have any choice about that? And if not, he need not have felt any guilt. Poor man.
Sorry. Who wants to comment? I mean, I can tell you what I think, but I wanted to hear what other people thought.
What the question is, do you?
I think he had perfect choice. The first 2 questions were put in a negative sense. You're not, are you? And then the third one was, you most certainly are. And so he in all ways denied it. And he denied it with swearing. We're told in some of the other Gospels that he proclaimed oaths and swore that he never knew Jesus.
Mm.
Right. Okay. So what we've got is then let's just read again. Read the end of chapter 18 from verse 28 to the end of the chapter, and then we'll turn over, but we'll have a little conversation just before. Somebody like to read, please?
Should I, Barry? I'll start anyway.
Yep.
Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we've no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?"
Pilate replied, "Do you think I am a Jew? It was your own people and the chief priests who handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish authorities. No, my kingdom does not belong here." So Pilate asked him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. I was born and came into the world for this one purpose, to speak about the truth. Whoever belongs to the truth listens to me." "And what is truth?" Pilate asked.
With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion.
Thank you. Okay, so just say a word of welcome to Chrissy. You come slide in quietly, Chrissy, and join in. We're just talking. We're in chapter 18 at the end of the chapter. Okay, so just looking at this, couple of things. Interesting that it talks about the chief priests in plural. So verse 35, for instance, your own people and chief priests handed you over. So do you remember we talked a little bit about this?
Yeah.
Because he was first taken to Annas, and Annas then sent him to Caiaphas. Now, John doesn't tell us anything about what he was questioned about at Caiaphas's house, as we shall see in the next chapter. And in fact, we don't get any evidence of him, anything he said there. But the chief priest was Caiaphas at the time, but they all came from the same family. So Annas would have been counted still as a chief priest, and possibly some other sons would have also counted as chief priests. So more than one chief priest. Another comment in verse 38, Pilate's retort, "What is truth?" is possibly a philosophical comment, because, of course, they were familiar with Plato and others at the time, and the issue of understanding what truth is. So it may surprise you that Donald Trump knows what the truth is. It's what comes out of his mouth is the truth. However, my truth doesn't agree with his. So truth can be a bit malleable. Somebody once in a church setting said that there was a certain lady who told lies. And the person that was in charge of the meeting said, "I wouldn't want to call her a liar, but I would say she handles the truth rather awkwardly." So truth is a bit flexible. Whose truth can we rely on? Jesus' truth. Yes.
God's truth.
Absolutely. So that's why it's really important. And the other thing is noticing about Barabbas. Barabbas had been arrested because he was an insurrectionist. He was leading rebellions, and he had been arrested. Possibly the two that were crucified with Jesus may have been part of his gang. We don't know. But Barabbas was well known for being an insurrectionist. Is that the right word? I think it is.
Who was that against? Sorry, Barry, who was that against? Was it against the religious leaders or the Romans?
No, it was against Rome.
I find that interesting that they released him, who was responsible for uprisings, while the Pharisees and the religious leaders considered that was what Jesus was, and that's why they were afraid of him. He stirred the people up. Yet one person who's already doing that is the one that's released. Yeah,
and they've manipulated Pilate into a situation. Pilate brings out the idea that it's your custom that one prisoner is released. And he gives them the option. Barabbas, who was clearly anti-Rome, or Jesus. They have already presented Jesus. The accusation against Jesus, as far as Pilate was concerned, was that Jesus was saying he was the king of the Jews. And they also suggest that he was teaching people not to pay tax. So there's this double level. With regards to the chief priests, what they're concerned about is that Jesus, in their minds, in their opinion, Jesus has been committing blasphemy by declaring himself to be the Son of God. So they say that's blasphemy. So on the grounds of blasphemy, under their law, he could have been stoned to death. But they had no power to sentence somebody to capital punishment. So they have to come to Pilate. So they present a different situation to Pilate. And so Pilate responds to the political argument, whereas the chief priest Annas was dealing with the religious one. But it just underlines the determination they had to get rid of. I hope it's not my croaky voice that's making you want to drink water, Fiona. It annoys me, and I should be annoying you through this evening's Bible discussion. So do come up with your ideas and comments, so give my voice a rest. Right, so any more comments on chapter 18?
I'm realising why I couldn't make out what you were first talking about when you introduced 18. It's the one I missed because we were still at the hospital. Well, we only got home about gone 6, and I thought, I don't remember that the last time. That's because I wasn't here.
Well, it's quite useful to do a look back at what we've done.
Yes.
Before we move forward. Are we ready to go to chapter 19?
Yes. You did.
Oh, good. Okay. Right. Okay. So, interesting situation. In all of the Gospels, more space is given to Jesus before Pilate than Jesus before Anna or Caiaphas. Caiaphas hardly mentioned, if at all. So what we notice at this meeting is that right from the start, Pilate knows that Jesus is not guilty of something terrible, and he tries again and again to release him. Every time he does so, he's thwarted. So this has happened. So let's read on from verse 1 to 11. Somebody read 1 to 11.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" How far, Barry? 11.
Okay, so comments and questions as we come. Anybody want to comment or question?
I feel very sorry for Pilate.
Oh, I meant to look up, when did Pilate come to Jerusalem? Because I have a feeling he's very new in the job. But he is in as far as Israel was concerned. So he was put in a very difficult position. He has to keep the peace. That's his job, just keeping the peace. And he is in a very difficult position.
Is he a governor? So I've got that right? Or...
Yes.
Yes. It surprises me that a man in that position should be so indecisive.
Well, I don't think he was indecisive. His problem was that the crowd that were there were not prepared to accept his judgment.
Oh.
I should think, Barry, that he was hoping that he could let Jesus go because Barabbas was such a troublemaker and everything. He just wanted to get rid of the troublemaker, but he was being forced to have the person he believed was innocent.
Yes. Yeah, the whole thing, the trial at the high priest's house began in the middle of the night and was conducted through the night, and that was illegal. That wasn't allowed. So he's had an illegal trial already, and now he's having a fair trial, but the judge's verdict is not being accepted. So they're applying political pressure. You see a bit later on how much pressure they put on him. So he hasn't got away with releasing Jesus and has had to release Barabbas. But the chapter 19 starts by telling us, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged.
Yeah.
Now he knows Jesus is innocent, but he's had him flogged. What's going on?
He's got to prove to the Jews that he's serious about doing what they want, I should imagine. Trying to placate them, isn't he?
Yes, in the sense of would it be enough?
Mm.
But the punishment was horrendous. A flogging under Roman law would involve a whip that had multiple strands made of leather with bits of bone or metal in the tips. So when it's whipped across the back, it would tear the flesh. It would open up the flesh. Remember, there's that Old Testament prophecy about a back being made like a ploughed field. But it would have looked horrendous. Some people died from a flogging. That was enough because of shock and blood loss, that they would die. So he's had Jesus flogged, dreadful beating. He's not half-hearted about this. And then he brings him out, and the soldiers have twisted together this crown of thorns, not little thorns, big thorns, and they put a purple robe on him, and they're mocking him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they go up to him and say that again and again, and slap him in the face. So his face has been smashed, bashed. His back is bleeding. He's looked at the mess. He's got a crown of thorns on his head. And Pilate brings him out and says, look at verse 4, "I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no basis for a charge against him." It's absolutely clear and adamant. Okay. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and purple robe, he says, "Here's the man." I think, well, they might possibly look at him and say, he's punished enough. But they don't. Okay. And what do? They immediately start shouting, "Crucify." Now, they're not in a house or a court. They're in a courtyard. Okay. They're gathered around, a great crowd of them, led by the chief priests, and they're gathered and they're talking to Pilate, who lives in the palace and has come out to meet them because they won't go in to talk with him. And they're shouting, "Crucify him, crucify." So Pilate's response to that is, "Well, you take him and crucify him. But as for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." So again, the third time he's saying this man is innocent, right? But the Jewish leaders insist, well, he's broken our law and he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. And if you look at verse 8, it's very interesting. When Pilate heard this, he was more afraid. Any suggestions as to why it might have made Pilate be more afraid? So Pilate is hearing for the first time, this man claims to be the Son of God. John tells us when Pilate heard it, he was even more afraid.
Well, he was afraid before.
Well, there is an incident that takes place that I think Luke tells us about. I'm not sure. It's in one of the Gospels, not in more than one. That Pilate's wife had a bad dream about it.
Yeah.
She came and advised Pilate not to have anything to do with it. So he might have been afraid because of that. The different accounts in the Gospels and the timing is sometimes difficult to match up perfectly.
So it seems as if Pilate has a sort of belief in a supernatural being, doesn't he? And he thinks that maybe this man really is a supernatural being or comes from a supernatural being.
If you think about Greek philosophy and Greek religion and so on, they had a number of deities. There were lots of gods, different gods, and there were sometimes when they had there were stories about gods who came down in the form of a human being. Now that's very different from Jesus being born of Mary and the Holy Spirit, but the idea of somebody coming from the gods was credible. So obviously, from Pilate's point of view, what they're saying implies in his understanding, his religion, that this may be one of these incidents of God coming in the form of man. So we see that he responds because he's made afraid, goes back into the palace and says, "Where do you come from?" So that's interesting. Where do you come from? Any other comments on those few verses?
Jesus doesn't answer that, though, does he, Barry?
No. If you read all the gospel accounts, we find Jesus answers some questions, but some he remains silent for. And very often he remains silent when it was critical that he speak out if he wants to have a defense. He doesn't fight for an opportunity to plead his innocence.
His silence, I should imagine, to Pilate would make him even more worried. The
Yeah,
fact that there's nothing.
yeah.
would
I'm
make
quite sure you're right. I mean, if you try to see this part of the gospel through the eyes of Pilate, you see it entirely differently. So if you could, I don't know how good you are at writing essays, but you write an essay on the part of Pilate of a dreadful experience I've had just recently in Jerusalem.
Interesting that Jesus more or less lets him off, doesn't he? Tells him that, he couldn't have done anything about it. He said, the one handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin.
Yes, in verse 11.
Yes, it's as if he does read the mind of Pilate and knows that he's struggling with his own responsibility and guilt.
On the subject of Jesus not sort of offering a defense and accepting the lies and slanderous accusations against him, it's quite intriguing that he does that. And the Gospels make reference to this being fulfilling some of the Old Testament prophecies. So I don't think it says it here in John, but it certainly does in Luke. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the meeting with Pilate, and it says interesting. I want to suggest if you haven't read other Gospels on this, read it through and just get a grip of those as well. But one of the prophecies that are very interesting about Jesus is how he would die. And there were suggestions about how he would die. But particularly outstanding from a Christian point of view is Psalm 22. Do you know how Psalm 22 begins? Take a minute to look back. Keep your finger in the place. Have a look back.
It's what Jesus said on the cross. My mind's gone blank. The last words Jesus said were the beginning of Psalm 22.
Jonah's nearly there.
Yeah.
My God, why have you forsaken me?
It's gone blank.
Yeah. And if you read that psalm, I mean, there is a story, I hope it's true, that a doctor was once asked, given the descriptions of what is described here in Psalm 22, where and was asked what is happening to this man, and the answer was the man is being crucified. So in a sense, Psalm 22 gives a description of somebody being crucified.
Yeah.
And is it either in Isaiah rather than Psalm 20? They pierced my hands and my feet, or is that in Psalm 22?
Yes, in 22.
Right.
I was thinking of Isaiah, that was talking about Jesus not always answering. The Isaiah passage, as a lamb before his shearers is dumb.
Yes. Yes. And we need to take all of that and look back into the Garden of Gethsemane and the prayer of Jesus. If it's possible, let this cup pass from me. He knew all that he was going to endure. So he went into it. I mean, that must have been horrendous, knowing all that was happening, and soon he would be nailed to a cross. It was quite common for criminals to be nailed to a cross under Roman law. But very often they would be also tied to the cross piece by rope. So they'd be tied up and still have nails hammered through the hands and feet. And the nails were huge spikes that were hammered through the nails and the feet of the criminal. So Jesus knew all this was coming to him. Terrible. So let's read on. Read on. We've got the comment, do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate says, don't you realize I have power either to free you or crucify you? So let's read 11 to 16.
Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at the place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified.
Thank you, Clive. That came through clearly. Okay, so comments and questions.
It's interesting that he was saying that Pilate was less guilty than the Jews, and yet it's Pilate who's actually signing the death warrant.
He's conceding to them, isn't he?
Yeah. And the thing is, the Jews were deliberately doing wrong. It was the decision they made.
Yes. I think we ought to remember, Jean, that there's no such thing as a little sin.
No.
All sins are sins, aren't they? But the point he's making is it was really stressing that he was being manipulated, really.
When I read this verse 11, I often wonder how much power our leaders in the world have today, and how much are they just part of God's purpose? I don't know whether it's a question that always comes to me.
Yes,
I think so, particularly at the present time with the issues regarding Ukraine and perhaps also the Middle East situation as well.
Oh, yes, yeah.
But we see a lot of injustice going on.
I mean, when the news said, was it last night or the night before, that Mr. Trump had arranged to discuss with Mr. Putin how they would divide up the precious metals and the land. And one of the commentators said, of course, it isn't theirs to divide.
no.
I mean, he was speaking as if, it was his own property to divide. And so, these men see themselves as kings of the world, really. And yet both of them claim to be God's people. They both claim to be Christ's. I mean, it's blasphemy, really, isn't it? It's blasphemy being acted out. At least I hope it is. I mean, I hope that they're not the real thing, because if they are, then I'm certainly not. And we're certainly not, are we? I mean, it's
we're encouraged to pray for those in authority over us. And I hope we do. And do all we can to be in political power is very dangerous. They say it's the highest kind of corruption there is. And so praying for them is really important, and respecting authority is okay, but it should never contradict scripture, should it?
I think, Barry,
or never be unjust. Sorry, Clive.
I think when Trump says and points to his head and says, "God protected me, saved me for a purpose." God saves people for different purposes. You don't know what they are.
Yes.
Here, look at Judas.
Yes, well said.
good point, Clive.
Okay, let's just reflect on it. Jump in if you've got a comment or a question you're wanting to ask. So Jesus responds to this issue about authority and power, and he did have power and authority, but it doesn't take away God's authority, which is ultimate. And then we have, from that moment on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. So he's already tried 3 times, and now he's trying again and again and again. So he's determined to set him free if he can. But the Jewish leaders respond by putting him under political pressure. They could send a report to Rome about Pilate and say Pilate isn't observing the law, that he's allowing somebody to continue to speak out against Rome and so on. So he knows he's in a dangerous situation. The people that are confronting him are capable of coming up with all sorts of lies. So it then talks about him coming out and sitting on a judgment seat called the Stone Pavement. And archaeologists have found at the ruins of the palace a place that would be so described, a raised situation on which, a bit like a stage, that Pilate sat down, and that's where he would normally pronounce judgment. Now, we do need to say something about verse 14. If you read Matthew's account, Mark's account, and Luke's account, they all have a different time to John. Here is John saying, at this stage in the events, this is just when Jesus is about to be crucified, taken to be crucified. He says it was about noon. Now, I think in two of the synoptic gospels, it tells us that it was about the third hour, which is 9 o'clock in the morning. So there's a discrepancy between the accounts that say it was 9 o'clock in the morning and John who's saying it's about noon. And it all has to do with how time is measured in different things. The language that's used in the Greek is that it was about 6. Okay, not that it was about noon, that it was 6. So it depends when the day was counted. So if it was counted in one way, it would be the same, different from another. However, also, there are sometimes copying mistakes. So if you've got any study Bibles or commentaries, if you look it up, it won't tell you who's right and who's wrong. But I think that it's sufficiently clear that it was 9 o'clock in the morning. It was 6 o'clock when they call on Pilate to pass judgment, and he spends from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock reasoning with them, trying to release Jesus, possibly also in that time sending Jesus to Herod, because John doesn't tell us about that incident, and he went and did a short visit to Herod and came back. So it probably is not about noon, it's probably more about 9 o'clock in the morning. Does anybody want to comment? No.
Actually, Barry, time in this country was different in different places, wasn't it? Before the railways came, it was only made all the same when the railways came to keep timetable.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, well, let's just read on a bit. The Pilate is he's being manipulated. He's pushed into a corner and he's got to pass sentence. And he has one more go. He presents Jesus. I can imagine getting the soldiers to push him forward. And there he is with his crown of thorns and his royal robe and already weakened by beating. And he says, "Here is your king." And they respond by saying, "Take him away, crucify him." His question, "Shall I crucify your king?" Their response, "We don't have a king, only Caesar. We have no king but Caesar." So finally, Pilate hands him over to be crucified. So it's a terrible kind of situation in which Pilate was manipulated, and despite his very best efforts to free Jesus, he was thwarted by the determination. Now, as you read those synoptic gospels, you'll find that it says after Jesus was arrested, in the early morning, as in the middle of the night, they start plotting. How can we get rid of this Jesus? We've got to get rid of him once and for all. Well, we'll have to have grounds to get him crucified. Well, what grounds have we got? Well, his claim to be king will be the easiest. You can imagine the plot being laid for Jesus to be crucified, and then Pilate so cleverly manipulated so that whatever he tries to do, it fails, and he hands Jesus over to be crucified. Anybody want to comment before we move on to seeing where it goes from there? Right, we've just got a few more minutes, about maybe 5 minutes or so. So somebody like to read from verse 16 through to 22.
Shall I go? Sorry, to 15, 16, 17, is it?
16.
16. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which is in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written."
Thank you, Chrissy. Okay, so this is almost like a last attempt by Pilate to have the last word in the situation. It was quite normal for those who were crucified to have their name and the accusation, the thing for which they were being punished, placed on wood as a sign above where they were hanging. Now, crucifixion is a horrendous form of punishment, apart from the hammering of the nails to hands and feet. Usually, before they even get to where they're going to be crucified, they are humiliated. So normally they are stripped naked. Now, I'm not sure whether Jesus was stripped naked before, because we're told later on that the soldiers took his clothes and divided them into 4 shares, one for each of them, and then they had to cast lots for the undergarment, which was like a shirt, long shirt. But if he wasn't naked before he was crucified, he was naked when he was. And it was done because humiliation was part of the punishment, the terrible thing they did. But the sign that Pilate has put up must be pretty big, because it's in 3 different languages. If you've seen images of the cross, you might see 4 letters that are written over, INRI. Have you seen that? INRI.
Yeah.
Okay, that's Latin. That's Jesus of Nazareth, King Rex of the Jews. Pilate is really having the last word here, making it clear. Aramaic was the common language of the day for Jews, but he also has it written in Latin and in Greek, so that there's no misunderstanding. He's very clear. And they want to get him to change it to, he claimed to be King of the Jews. So that's a kind of compromise they were prepared to make, but he won't be compromised. He says, "What I have written, I have written." So it's very positive. Anybody want to comment on those? Okay, let's read on a little bit more. So you read.
Sort of pleased. I'm pleased that Pilate withstood that pressure. I mean, I feel that it's such a petty issue, really, but I'm still pleased that Pilate resisted their pressure.
Yes. Yeah. You can write your essay if you like on a terrible day in my life by Pilate.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, if we'd been him, wouldn't you be exhausted at this point? I mean, I think you would be exhausted, trying to find a reason to let this man go, particularly if he thought that he really was supernatural, and knowing that they were trying to tie him in knots. It's a very exhausting situation.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so let's just read again from verse 22 again, and we read 22 to 24. Somebody else.
Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says. They divided my clothing among themselves, and for my clothing they...
So that's a quote. Where does it come from? That's Psalm 22. Again. So Psalm 22 is very clear. Right. So I want you to try and picture Jesus in a weakened state has staggered from the heart of Jerusalem out to Golgotha, and he's carrying the cross piece of the cross, just the cross bit, not the upright. And Simon of Cyrene gets pressured into taking his place and carrying it for him. When he gets to the place where he is about to be crucified, he would have been laid down on his back with the crosspiece across his shoulders, and then each of his hands would be lifted up and nails would be driven through his hands, and then his feet would be later put on the upright, and that would be nailed. But having nailed him, they would probably tie his wrists or his forearms onto the crosspiece as well, and then they fit that. Maybe it was slotted in to the upright, but they would put it in, and then they pick the upright in. There was normally a footrest, so his feet would have been nailed to that footrest. So nails are driven through this. I mean, just experiencing that's horrendous enough. Well, the whole thing is his dignity is taken away from him. He's been stripped naked, and he's been put there, and then he's lifted up in front of them all on a cross. Possibly not a really exceptionally high place, but about head height at least. His feet would have been head height. And it was normal for people to spit and throw things at the people when they were crucified. So just imagine all of that's going on, and all of that he's enduring for me because of my sin. He's there because of my sin. It's my fault that he's there, because there was no other good enough to pay the price of sin. He only could unlock the gate of heaven and let us in. So it's an absolutely dreadful situation, and what is about to take place lasts for at least 3 hours. And during this time, the sky is darkened. And we go on next week, God willing, hopefully without a cough, to go over some of the things when Jesus was hanging. And again, I just want to suggest, if you've got time or can make time, to read Matthew's account, somewhere around probably chapter 27, and Mark's account, which I think is Mark 15, and Luke's account, which I think you'll find is in Luke 21, I think. Okay. And then when we meet, we'll have that in our minds as well. And then we'll go through what John has to say. What was it that John wanted us to notice? So do you think John wanted us to get an idea of how manipulative his enemies were? Does he want to present Pilate as a weak person, or just someone who wasn't weak but was made in a sense weak by the way they manipulated him, for how he determinedly hits back by putting this sign up over the head of Jesus? Trying to think, what is it that John wants us to get out of this? What are we supposed to be taking note of, and why? Any final comments?
I've often wondered why the soldiers would want any of Jesus' clothes. Did they think that one day it might be worth quite a lot?
Well, no, I doubt that, John. I don't think there was any acquisitiveness involved. I mean, it was a way of boosting their income. They give them something they can sell. Now, we don't know much about the clothes that Jesus wore. In Fiona's reading, it said tunic that Jesus was left with. In a lot of the pictures of Jesus on the cross, he's wearing a loincloth. That never used to happen. But the undergarment that they're talking about that was made in one piece was really like a shirt, you know. So it's like a shirt that was worn, and other bits were wrapped over or tied round the waist. Remember, Jesus took some of the clothes off in order to wash the feet of his disciples. But he wasn't naked when he did that, because he still had the shirt there. So there probably was some form of underpants, and then there was this tunic, and then other bits like a skirt or a jacket and so on were added. Obviously enough, there must have been 4 separate items of clothing at least for them to have shared it out between them. That just gives them 1 piece each. So we know that's the minimum. So quite a few bits of clothing.